Hello and welcome to another episode of the Passing Through podcast. I wanted to welcome the new listeners because I see a bunch of new people have either subscribed or listened, and I just wanted to take a moment to notice them and longtime listeners who support this podcast and make it all possible. I try not to pay attention to any stats or metrics, but I do periodically peek in just to see if there's an upward trend in listenership or if I'm just spiraling out of control, recording into the abyss, making demented music and strange bits about flies that showcase my mental decline or my descent into madness. I sometimes wonder, am I just a homeless, unemployed vagrant living in a van, slowly losing my mind until some tragedy strikes? Until I accidentally freeze to death or suffocate from forgetting to turn the gas off one night? Only you can tell, dear listeners. So, if you're enjoying this show, if it gives you a giggle, or if I tell an interesting story, or accidentally say something insightful, please consider subscribing and giving it a rating. It really helps me get new and exciting guests, and maybe in some small way, it helps my sanity. So right now, I'm passing through Hungary. I'm still here. I'll be here for another couple of weeks. And today is a lovely sunny day to break up what's been a monotonous, cold and gray period. My throat hurts and my nose is a little stuffy. You might be able to hear that. I don't know, but if you can, I apologize. I will do what I can to correct it in post, but I predict that this will be an absolutely fucking fuzzy episode.
Skibbity-bop, bobbity-boo-bop, skip-body, skip-bop, I got fuzz on my feet. Take it down. I got a fuzzy navel. I got a fuzzy on my nose. I got fuzz in my toes. I got fuzz in the bag. Yeah, Papa's got a brand new bag of fuzz. Fuzzing it up. Yeah. Ooh! Skibbity bop, dap ba doo. Skeet beep, skeet, skeet. Boom! From the windows to the walls. Skeet, skeet, skeet. Skibbity bop, bow, boom. Ooh! Ah!
I was reading the other day that the main reason people listen to podcasts is actually to learn. This was shocking to me because I assumed that most people listened for entertainment. And not that this podcast is particularly entertaining, but educational is definitely not a word that I would use to describe it. As someone who, for a time when I was a kid, wanted to be a teacher, I began asking myself, what is it that I really know? What could I teach on this podcast? But nothing comes to mind. Carl Jung, world-famous psychologist, is quoted as having said, "Everything before 40 is just research." And as someone approaching 40, I'm hoping to be an expert in a field soon. Any field, any day now. I feel it. So in the interest of providing some content that might make your brain swell like you drank too much water at a 90s rave after consuming a pill of questionable origin in the bathroom of said rave, let me take you on a journey of sight and sound. Actually, just sound. This is an audio-only podcast. My face isn't meant for video. At least not yet. I'm waiting for the big bucks to flow in so that I can get extensive plastic surgery done on my face and then broadcast it all over YouTube so everyone could look at me with admiration and envy at my beauty. But right now, I'm not there yet. And so I want to tell you a story about a Hungarian man by the name of József Galamb. I don't know if I'm pronouncing his last name correctly, but I'm going to continue to mispronounce it multiple times for the duration of this podcast. So forgive me, any Hungarians who are listening and cringing and shock and disgust. But I want to tell you a story about how József Galamb unwittingly caused the rise of the United States as a superpower and contributed to ecological collapse and climate catastrophe that we see today. So József was a precocious young Hungarian boy with a knack for mechanical engineering, and by the time he was, I think, 24, he had already traveled to numerous countries and secured a job in America working with Henry Ford, who most listeners probably are familiar with. And it was actually Galamb who designed the iconic Ford Model T. Now, most people probably know Henry Ford and they know the Model T, and they know that this was an early automobile. But what was significant about the Model T was that it brought the automobile into the hands of the masses. It was easier to operate, parts were more user-friendly and repairable, and most importantly, it was cheap. It was affordable. It made it possible for more people to have a car, a thing that would forever change the landscape of not just cities, but the landscape of the planet itself. Just to pause for a second and try to conceive of the explosive changes that this produced, consider how many cars were in existence in 1915. What do you think? It was 2 million. That's a pretty big number. I was surprised that it was that high. But after the Model T was introduced, by 1923, there were about 13 million cars on the road. Some estimates even put it higher at 15 million. That's incredible. So in less than 2 decades, that number increased by 7-fold. That's pretty staggering to me. But the Model T isn't where József's story ends. And it's not the point of this podcast. József Galamb goes on with another Hungarian engineer by the name of Eugene Farkas to create the device that I really want to talk about today. The Fordson tractor. Now, tractors had been around for a while already, but they were large, heavy, and expensive, which made them pretty ill-suited for most farmers. But at the turn of the 20th century, people in North America and Europe were absolutely fucking clamoring for small, inexpensive tractors. And so that's where József Galamb and Eugene Farkas come in. They think to themselves, fuck it, let's just take the Model T that we just made and turn the fucking thing into a tractor. It's brilliant. And the tractor prototyping was completed by 1916, which happens to be at the height of World War I. And Britain was literally starving for tractors as a way to boost agricultural output and decrease its dependency on imported food. So Henry Ford starts exporting these tractors like mad to Britain. They even build factories overseas in Cork, Ireland, when it was still part of the UK. And demand starts to increase all over, domestically, abroad, the UK, and even Russia. And by the time 1925 rolls around, less than 10 years since the first Fordson tractor was introduced, Ford has produced 500,000 tractors. 500,000. This rapidly mechanized agriculture, not just in America, but in Europe as well. Because with one of those tractors, you could do with one person what 10 or 20 people were doing before. So now World War I comes to an end, and a bunch of soldiers come home and they flood the workforce. This drives up unemployment, and when paired with the rise of the tractors, puts even more pressure on a desperate situation, leading to a depression. there's no work, there's a Spanish flu, and things get pretty dire there for a bit. But just for a moment, until the Great Depression, where the stock market collapses, causing a monstrous downturn in the global economy. But now back to József Galamb's invention, the Fordson tractor. In the aftermath of the Great Depression, 19 states in the heartland of the United States, commonly referred to as the Great Plains, had seen a boom in agricultural production due to the introduction of said tractor. This effect was made stronger by the fact that combines used the Fordson as a platform to build more complex machines. To describe what a combine is, just imagine the vehicle that József Galamb had engineered, the Model T, and build on top of it a machine that can perform a whole bunch of agricultural functions to really increase efficiency and production and reduce the need for workers. So this is what a combine is. So you have your small, lightweight tractors that individual farmers might be using, and then you have these combines that might be allowing for and encouraging larger scale production. So now it's possible to harvest massive amounts of grain. But when the national economy went into decline in the late 1920s due to the Great Depression, agriculture was even more adversely affected than other sectors. And because of a record wheat crop in 1931, it sent crop prices even lower. So these were perhaps all-time lows. People were becoming fearful, desperate, and the lower prices meant that farmers needed to cultivate even more land, including like poorer farmland, things that people wouldn't want to work on, or they had to change their crop varieties to produce enough grain to meet the required payments for their equipment and the land that they were working on. And so this is where my hot take comes in, because what I wanted to do was give you a couple of fun facts about Hungary. And I went down a rabbit hole of discovering that Hungary has a lot of inventors. And one of them is József Galamb. Another is a guy who invented the ballpoint pen. And there's probably a very interesting history that I could trace about the ballpoint pen, but it seemed to me a little bit more pertinent to the topics of this podcast, since the ramifications for mass production of automobiles and mechanizing agriculture has direct ramifications and consequences on us today in terms of ecology, in terms of the climate, in terms of fossil fuel production, in terms of employment, in terms of farming. So this to me seemed like the more interesting story. Maybe I'll give you a couple of fun facts about Hungary at the end here to make this episode even more informative. But my hot take on this is that the settlers and the farmers in this region, through just sheer carelessness, had overgrazed and overexploited the soil, in part due to the industrial technology like the Fordson tractor and the combines that József Galamb and Eugene Farkas introduced to the world. So the settlers and the farmers here just devastate the topsoil. They overwork it with animals and machines and just obliterate it. Now, some listeners might be thinking, what is topsoil? Topsoil is the top layer of the soil. Pretty self-explanatory, right? It's the first few inches of the soil. It's usually what you see when you reach down and you grab a fistful of dirt out of the soil. And it has all the nutrients and fertility and organic matter and biological microorganisms that actually let you grow food. And an interesting note here is that when you grow food, you're not actually trying to grow your plants. Lots of people mistakenly believe this. What you're trying to do is to grow the soil, not the plant, because the soil feeds the plant. The soil nurtures the plant. The soil itself is alive. Did you know that there's actually more life below the ground than above it? I'll say that again because it's a little bit mind-bendy. There's more life below the surface of the soil than above it. In a single tablespoon of soil, there's an estimated 50 billion microbes and microorganisms. So in the Great Plains, they were absolutely smashing the topsoil and mismanaging the land, not protecting it from erosion or strong winds or thinking of what might happen if there were a drought. So when a drought did come, and boy, did the droughts come, when the wind blew in after or during a drought, huge swaths of topsoil were just blown away, dried out, and lost. And this is where the term Dust Bowl comes from. So in the early 1930s to 1940, a series of rolling droughts just crippled the region and caused what can only be seen as a man-made ecological disaster. People were starving, forced to abandon their farms and flee. Citizens in the United States had never seen anything like this. If you look at the photos from that time period, they are harrowing. There are these old black and white photos of monstrous clouds just engulfing dilapidated, deserted farmlands. It looks like something out of a post-apocalyptic horror movie. American author John Steinbeck wrote The Grapes of Wrath, arguably, in my opinion, his masterpiece about this topic, and it's a heartbreaking story. It's gorgeously written and probably one of the greatest pieces of literature that I've ever read, maybe even ever written. And I'll read you a little bit of it now because maybe you haven't read it. I know it's often required reading in the States, but I know a lot of listeners are international here. So let me just read you 2 little paragraphs from the novel that I think are exceptional and capture the pain and the he does a good job of painting what the emotional landscape must have been like at that time and that place for those people. And so I'll read that for you now. The works of the roots of the vines, of the trees, must be destroyed to keep up the price. And this is the saddest, bitterest thing of all. Carloads of oranges dumped on the ground. The people came from miles to take the fruit, but this could not be. How would they buy oranges at 20 cents a dozen if they could drive out and pick them up? And men with hoses squirt kerosene on the oranges, and they are angry at the crime, angry at the people who have come to take the fruit. 1 million people hungry, needing the fruit, and kerosene sprayed over the golden mountains. And the smell of rot fills the country. Burn coffee for fuel in the ships. Burn corn to keep warm. It makes a hot fire. Dump potatoes in the rivers and place guards along the banks to keep the hungry people from fishing them out. Slaughter the pigs and bury them, and let the putrescence drip down into the earth. There is a crime here that goes beyond denunciation. There is a sorrow here that weeping cannot symbolize. There is a failure here that topples all our successes. The fertile earth, the straight tree rows, the sturdy trunks, and the ripe fruit, and children dying of pellagra must die because a profit cannot be taken from an orange. And coroners must fill in the certificate, died of malnutrition, because the food must rot, must be forced to rot. The people come with nets to fish for potatoes in the river, and the guards hold them back. They come in rattling cars to get the dumped oranges, but the kerosene is sprayed. And they stand still and watch the potatoes float by. Listen to the screaming pigs being killed in a ditch and covered with quick lime. Watch the mountains of oranges slop down to a putrefying ooze. And in the eyes of the people, there is the failure. And in the eyes of the hungry, there is a growing wrath. And the souls of the people, the grapes of wrath, are filling and growing heavy for the vintage. What a writer. If that's not great writing, holy fuck. And he really not only gets at the loss and the injustice of it all, and the needlessness of it, the triviality of it, But he draws attention to why this is happening. For profit, because of industry, because of money, because of greed, because of systems that move capital out of the hands of people in need and into the hands of the wealthy, of the business owners, large-scale industrial agriculture, who would rather those oranges burn and those pigs be slaughtered, rather than let starving people eat them for free. And so this was the world that was created back then, in my opinion, in no small part due to the engineering achievements of József Galamb and Eugene Farkas. And this isn't to say that either of those men were evil or that they had ill intentions. I'm sure they wanted to do an interesting thing and make cars available to people. Because before that time, transport was rough and dodgy. You know, when people were traveling from the east to the west in America, we had this game when we were kids called Oregon Trail. And the game was just a brutal game where most of the time you would lose. But if you did manage to make it across the country without getting bitten by a rattlesnake, without having your cow break its leg, without being attacked by a marauding band, without getting dysentery, without some tragedy befalling you, you would arrive at your destination and almost your entire family would be dead. And it would take months to do this. So I'm sure at that time people saw this kind of travel as dangerous, and they thought that it would be a safer, better, easier world if the dangers of travel were reduced and more places were made more accessible to more people. These seem like noble ideas, and in a way they are, but often what happens is that humans have a good idea and we implement something and we don't factor in the unseen or unintended effects. And in this case, I think the Dust Bowl is a great example, because you have mechanized agriculture come in, and in a short period, a massive amount of tractors are produced, and the farming habits change, and the way that people are doing things changes. And the incentive isn't respect for the land, the incentive is profit. It's to pay back the cost of the machine, or it's to do more now that you have the machine. And this isn't even to account for the people who are unemployed by these technologies. All these soldiers returning who found themselves out of a job because they'd been replaced by tractors. But what I want to draw attention to is the effect on the ecology, on the landscape, on the topsoil that was lost, on the birds, on the insects, on whatever creatures lived in that region and depended on it for food because of our interventions, because of the machines we made, because of the lack of foresight. We caused untold destruction and ecological chaos for that region. And I think this is fractal. I think that we can look at this and we can say, this was the near-term impact of this change. Maybe I'm completely wrong, but just for the sake of story and for the sake of argument, let's say that these things were related. If we scale that up to now, 100 years later, and we see what the impacts of expanding automotives out to everyday people, building up highways, infrastructure, designing cities around cars instead of pedestrians and cyclists, deprioritizing public transit in favor of everyone's own independent, autonomous little vehicle. We can see what the impact of that is. Like if you compare the particulate matter in the air now to pre-industrial levels, it's horrifying. We're breathing air that's full of just byproducts from combustion and from manufacturing and from industry, from aerosols sprayed by planes. We have microplastics in our brains, in our guts, in our bodies, in the topsoil, in Antarctic sea ice, in snowfall, in rain. There's even nanoplastics that we're finding inside oceans, inside the fish that we eat. And when plastic was invented, it was thought to be revolutionary. It was going to save lives, all the medical applications. And it did, and it still does. But that's only part of the picture. And we as humans often prove to be very short-sighted when it comes to looking at the whole picture. So yeah, just to close the loop a little bit, because I talked about how this random Hungarian inventor inadvertently contributed to the state that we're in now as a global people. But I didn't really talk much about the rise of the US as a superpower. And I may be wrong here, and there may be a little bit of like bong water conspiracy talk here that I don't mean in that way. But I do think there had to be some level of influence when the US decided to enter into World War II. There had to be some connection to the proliferation of automobiles and tractors and large-scale agriculture that facilitated this. Because if everything that I've just said is true, and the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl and the end of World War I and all of this stuff is kind of connected and they bleed into one another, then the position that we were in as a nation when Franklin Delano Roosevelt was president had to play some role in him deciding whether or not to enter into World War II. Because you have to remember that back then, in the aftermath of World War I and the Depression and everything that had happened, the country was very resistant to entering into World War II. There was kind of an isolationist, protectionist stance that said, you know what, let's take care of what's happening here and protect our own. We don't need to get embroiled in another world war after we're reeling from the first one. And there was the market collapse and all of this crop loss and all of the problems that we're facing. We don't want to be back fighting a war overseas. And this is a reasonable stance. But similar to today, more and more people were seeing that atrocity was being perpetrated, that there were people being ethnically cleansed, that a genocide was happening, that untold horrors were being dispensed on people. And slowly, more and more people started looking, and they started thinking, can we turn away from this? Is it right to look away knowing what's happening, knowing that so many countries are in danger? And that's just the moral arc, right? I'm a little bit of a pessimist when it comes to the moral arc of governments. I think the moral arc of a people is real, and you can see it happening now. All over the world, people are protesting Israel's actions in Palestine. But governments are still arming and funding Israel. The governments aren't people. So I don't imagine governments ever having any incentive to do what's moral. I'm more of the mind that governments are motivated by economics, by what they stand to gain financially. And back in World War II, I think that someone probably realized that there was considerable money to be made by entering into World War II. And that's the sum of my hot take. The United States was bombed by the Japanese at Pearl Harbor in 1941. This is just in the aftermath of the Dust Bowl. And this gave people enough reason to enter into this war and decide to get involved. And I'm not saying that this was a staged attack or FDR knew about it. I'm not saying anything like that at all. I'm just saying like that was a sort of gift from the universe. I don't think any maneuvering or political cunning on behalf of FDR would have been able to orchestrate that event. But I think it kind of fell into his lap and he said, this is what we've been waiting for. we can go into this war now. And when we send all of our troops overseas, this will obviously help unemployment. It will help manufacturing. We'll be able to export more tractors and weapons, and this will give us an amazing boost to the economy. And if we win, if we help topple these powers that threaten to expand and control large regions of the geopolitical arena, then we will have some say in shaping what the future of said arena looks like. And that's exactly what happened. So to me, it's not a grand conspiracy. It's just looking at an opportunity and saying, the opportunity is right here. It's like sitting down at a blackjack table in a casino and you look at your cards and you've got a 10 and an ace. There's no reason for you not to go all in at that point. And so I think this is how we start with a random Hungarian engineer, and we find ourselves with the United States as a superpower and large-scale industrial agriculture and the automotive industry and transportation and all of these things as clear contributors to the current state of the world today. And that's my semi-educational, semi-hot take, semi-deranged, head-cold rambling as I sit here and think about what kind of educational content I might be able to provide. I did mention that I would share a couple of fun facts about Hungary as well, to put a little cherry on top of what is perhaps the most educational episode I've ever put out. And that is that the largest synagogue in Europe is in Hungary. And it's not only the largest synagogue in Europe, but it is the second largest synagogue in the world, which is pretty impressive. It's down in Budapest, and I've been down there and I've seen it, and it is incredible. I recommend anyone who's ever in Budapest to go and check it out. It is lovely. It is a work of immense architecture and importance to Jewish people. It is beautiful to behold, so I strongly recommend you to check that out. I mentioned inventors, but I didn't mention that Hungary actually has the second oldest underground railway system in the world after London, in Budapest. It began operating in 1896, which is a bit mind-boggling to think about. That's even before the Model T was made. And the other fun fact that I'll tell you about Hungary is that it has one of the world's first wine regions. I have yet to drink any wine in Hungary. I will before I leave here. But they estimate that wine was being produced in northeastern Hungary since the 5th century, which is like more than a century before France's Bordeaux region. So those are a few fun facts from here. I'm going to go get some rest, drink some tea, and I didn't give you an eco tip yet this week. Usually every episode I provide an eco tip, which is like some small way that you can make a difference to the environment, and I try to keep them unique every episode. So this eco tip here is avoid using AI as best as you can. And I'm not saying you have to never use it or completely eliminate it, but I think people aren't aware of the huge environmental cost of AI and the amount of water it takes to cool these servers that the computations run on, and the amount of electricity. I was reading an article lately that made it sound like Bitcoin mining was a walk in the park compared to how energy intensive running AI queries are. And for all intents and purposes, it seems like entire sectors and industries are just going full bore into AI. And I can see why. It's a powerful new technology. It's revolutionary, in my opinion. I understand the appeal. But again, to bring us back to the whole fucking topic and thematic core of this episode, it's that when there's a new technology that's revolutionary and can make everyone's lives easier and has wide applications, we should pause to consider what the consequences of said technology are. If we are already, as a global people, suffering under an energy crisis, under an ecological crisis, under a climate crisis, doing something to put further burden and strain on an already overburdened and unsustainable energy system is not something I would advise. I was even creating a graphic novel using Midjourney and Stable Diffusion. It was going to be an environmental graphic novel, a little piece of propaganda that I wanted to create. But part of the reason why I scrapped it, in addition to just having too many other things going on and losing a bit of the mojo that was necessary to continue, I started to learn about these things and realize that using AI to do this kind of is not aligned with the whole message of the graphic novel, so it didn't really make sense anymore. So now when you go onto Google, they want to automatically enable Google AI to help, refine your searches or give you extra features. Everybody wants to go on ChatGPT or use things like Midjourney or whatever the hot new AI thing is, whether it's making music or video. It's all super cool and it's all really empowering and kind of democratizes the creative process out to the masses. And I see the appeal of it and it's lovely and amazing. And on one hand, I celebrate it. But on the other hand, it doesn't just cause impact to artists and people who are skilled craftsmen in terms of video composition, art, music. It also has profound environmental impact. And I'll put a link in the show notes so people can check out an article and just familiarize themselves a little more with AI. But that would be my tip this week. Try to avoid using AI. If it's completely necessary for your job, of course, I get it. Use it. But if you're just doing it for leisure and you're banging out prompts all day long, making queries, having fun, laughing, chatting back and forth with AI, trying to determine whether or not it's self-aware or it's become sentient. I get it. When I was a kid, we had AOL Instant Messenger. We had Smarter Child on there. It was fun to talk to a robot. I get it. But if you want your future to look like something worse than the Dust Bowl, I don't know. Am I a doomer? Am I just spouting wild nonsense, trying to scare people into not using AI? Do I sound like some kind of Luddite rambling from the inside of a van? Maybe. Maybe not. Time will tell, friends. Time will tell. As always, be good to one another, and I will talk to you next week.